So, welcome to Critical Race Theory Thursday. As you may know, I've been taking Thursdays as an opportunity to explain critical race theory, each week picking an idea, a concept, a device from critical race theory in order to explain what it really is. So today, I want to do a little background, just setting of why did the critical race theory movement begin in the first place? And it was an outgrowth of something called the critical legal studies movement. It was a group of legal scholars who were also very involved in politics in the late 60s and early 70s, anti-war politics, racial justice politics, to some extent gender, but not so much. And what the critical legal studies people and then the critical race studies people did was kind of expose the myths and impossible promises of law. So those included the story that law tells about itself, that it's objective and it's neutral. And in that sense, we see judges like Chief Justice Roberts, when he comes for his confirmation hearing before the Senate, says, look, judges are just umpires like in baseball. We're just calling balls and strikes. We don't have a bias one way or the other for one team or the other. We're just applying the rules to the cases that come before us.
I have no agenda, but I do have a commitment. If I am confirmed, I will confront every case with an open mind. I will fully and fairly analyze the legal arguments that are presented. I will be open to the considered views of my colleagues on the bench. And I will decide every case based on the record, according to the rule of law, without fear or favor, to the best of my ability. And I will remember that it's my job to call balls and strikes and not to pitch or bat.
We're neutral, we're objective, the rules actually have right answers, we'll produce right answers, either it was a ball or it was a strike, either the plaintiff should win or the defendant should win, because that's what the rules require. The judges aren't themselves bringing any bias, any preferences, any kind of particular personal values to the process of legal adjudication. They're just umpires. And the legal realists and the critical race studies people said, that's baloney. Judges are people, and in large measure, what the critical race studies people contributed was several particular critiques of law and the idea of law's neutrality. And what they said, the critical race studies people building on the critical legal studies thinkers, is that law plays an essential role in the construction and the maintenance of social and racial domination and subordination. So not only is law not dismantling race-based equality or inequality, it's actually reinforcing it and justifying it. So too, the critical race theory intervention says law is not objective. The distance and detachment are impossible. Every judge is a person. Every judge comes to a case with their own histories and preferences, and that the idea of their somehow standing outside the game itself is an impossible myth that law tells about itself to justify itself. And so part of what the critical legal studies and critical race theorists are doing is analyzing Supreme Court cases and litigation more generally to show how not only is law not neutral and objective, but actually the law, and this I think is one of the most radical things about critical race theory, the concept of equality itself, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, does the work of reinforcing and justifying and legitimizing race-based inequality in this country. So those are very big and radical ideas that we see coming from critical race theory. So how do they do that? Well, for the most part, the critical race studies scholars were people of color, but there were a few early scholars and others along the way. I actually count myself as a critical race studies scholar, who were white, and they made important contributions that moved, that developed, that really enriched critical race studies coming out of the, as I said, the critical legal studies movement. Alan Freeman is one of those white scholars, and he wrote a piece entitled "Legitimizing Racial Discrimination Through Anti-Discrimination Law, a Critical Review of Supreme Court Doctrine." I remember reading this article in law school and it blew my mind. It really changed the way I thought about what law can possibly deliver and where its limits lie. And the concept that he offers us in this Legitimizing Racial Discrimination Through Anti-Discrimination Law article is that, again, judges and the law are not neutral and objective. When we look closely at some of the most important race discrimination cases, they will take either the perpetrator or the victim perspective. Where they start from, how their reasoning evolves in those cases reflects either the position of those who are the victims of race-based discrimination or those who are the perpetrators of that discrimination. And in the end, he says the problem with the limits of the ways in which the equality jurisprudence disappoints us can lie in the fact that the courts have always taken the perpetrator perspective. So what's he talking about with victim's perspective and perpetrator perspective? So as Freeman lays it out, a victim's perspective would be one which understands the systematic ways in which society is structured around race discrimination is not about one-off events. One employer denying employment to a black person, one school acting in a way that's discriminatory against certain students. It's actually structural. It's part of the very fabric of society, and it can't be isolated into particular individuals engaging in bad ways. If we want to remedy, want to change a racist society, we have to get at the underlying structures, the underlying systems that hold it in place. And to do that requires not just rules saying thou shalt not discriminate, but also affirmative measures that redistribute power, that dismantle those structures that hold a society that is based in race-based discrimination and disadvantage in place. So we need systematic remedies, and we need affirmative remedies to dismantle those forms of injustice. So with this perpetrator's perspective, what the law focuses on is the individual acts of bad apples, as it were. Who is the racist employer? What are the ways in which law intentionally sorted people by race into what schools they could go? If we could isolate those individual bad actors, make them pay a legal penalty, then we will restore what is an otherwise just society. And the problem lies in those individuals who are behaving badly, who are behaving in racist ways, not something that lies at the feet of society entirely. Now, one of the ways that Friedman points this out is through these two concepts that we talk about in law all the time: fault and causation. And these play very important roles in anti-discrimination law. The concept of fault, as he describes it, which is something that is essential to our anti-discrimination legal structures, is that the only people who can be found guilty of engaging in race discrimination are people who have been found at fault. They have intentionally and purposefully engaged in acts that were racially discriminatory. And so any kind of unintentional acts would not count as violating anti-discrimination laws. And what that does in the reverse, or as a component, is it creates a class of innocent people who may be the beneficiaries of white-based advantage, of the wind kind of being at their back on the basis of their race and an intergenerational advantage, but they don't intentionally discriminate against people of color. They're just sort of lucky to be the beneficiaries of white privilege, right? And so the benefits that accrue to them are not ones that would be within the realm of what anti-discrimination law would address. So fault is an incredibly important idea. Let's isolate the bad apples, make them pay a price for what they did, make them stop acting the way they were, and then we have a racially just society once we've eliminated those intentional bad actors. The second component is a concept of causation, that the law can only address and redress instances of intentional discrimination that actually caused someone's disadvantage. Now, it's very difficult in a society where social systems, webs of power and cultural dynamics are swirling around us all the time. It's very difficult to isolate one thing that you can say caused the fact that, let's say, overall, black people have much less family wealth than white people do. Overall, black schools, majority black schools, are actually not as good as schools as many well-funded white schools are. What caused that? Is there a single thing we can look to? A single bad actor? A single bad decision? Usually not. Usually it is a system of overlapping and mutually reinforcing societal dynamics that make it the case that white people have accumulated wealth, get better education, housing is better, our health is better, etc. And so these twin concepts of fault and causation are ones that Freeman looks at in this article to say that law actually adopts a perpetrator's perspective. You can only hold me responsible for race discrimination if you can show that I engaged in actions intentionally that specifically caused an individual person's racial disadvantage. And that's a very small set of things that we can look to that would fit that requirement. So what Freeman urges is that we expose the perpetrator perspective that holds in place all of the social structures that not intentionally, but as a system, privilege whiteness and disadvantage blackness intergenerationally. And instead, we focus on the perspective of those who are most disadvantaged in society and look at outcomes. Look at the disadvantage itself and say what kind of remedies would be necessary to dismantle that. Because the society itself is structured around a kind of agnosticism about those very structures. That, oh, they just seem natural, they just exist. No one is at fault for creating them, right? I didn't actually cause individually anybody's disadvantage, it's just happening. And you know, the worst version of that is it is black people's fault, right? If they just worked harder, if they were just better citizens, etc., they would get ahead and experience less disadvantage, right? So it's either creating innocence in white people or implying or explicitly expressing a kind of blame the victim politics. And that, again, is a perpetrator perspective that Freeman urges us to abandon in anti-discrimination law and to instead substitute a results-oriented, victim-based perspective that actually addresses the underlying structures that perpetuate, maintain, and ultimately legitimize a racist social structure. Alan Freeman, incredibly important scholar, writing in the 1970s on this idea of the perpetrator perspective and the victim perspective in anti-discrimination law. That's your Critical Race Theory Thursday for today.